Okay, so what is a knockoff in toy terms? I would define a knockoff as a product that is copying another product without permission. It's fairly straightforward as a concept, but just because something looks like something else doesn't necessarily make it a knockoff. So, let's start from bare bones here, because I like a good definition. Intellectual property rights, copyright, design right, patents, all good stuff. And a lot of these rights you get automatically, some of them you have to register. If I produce some bananas and I'm the first one to do it, and I registered the design of a banana, if anyone else tries to produce a banana, they are potentially infringing my rights in the banana. Okay? However, I can give them permission to create a copy of my banana, and then their bananas will not be knockoffs. They will be licensed bananas. Okay? Now, the different flavours of protection that you get from intellectual property rights last for differing amounts of time. And this is an interesting one because it means that things like Masterpiece Transformers could be considered knockoffs apart from the fact that they don't need to be licensed anymore, because the three-dimensional design of the Transformers is no longer protected, because those three-dimensional designs only last for so long under protection, and then that protection expires. It can vary a bit from country to country, but you'll notice that with those sorts of Transformers knockoffs, which they're not particularly, for reasons I've just explained, the names of the Transformers survive longer with protection via copyright or possibly even trademarks than the three-dimensional designs do, which is why they reinvent the names of those reproduced Transformers in order to avoid getting the original owner's backs up. So it's a very, very clever line that they're not crossing there. So that's one way that something can be ostensibly a knockoff, but actually not be infringing anyone, and therefore no one is going to come after them. Now, this one is an interesting example because you might recall I've done a few Jetfire videos recently, and I say this is an interesting example because the paint job on this is not actually the original paint job. It didn't have the Jetfire paint job originally. So this was never actually an official Jetfire knockoff. And when I got it from eBay, I was fully expecting it to be fully plastic and quite cheap. But actually, it's got metal to it. This is a converter. And I actually found out about these through YouTube. I think I'd been watching this already for a little while because I was kind of curious about where it had come from. And it turns out, to my amusement, that this is not a knockoff. So what happened with this, and you might be familiar with the Harmony Gold Robotech saga. Harmony Gold took a license for Robotech toys from the original creators of Macross for the first season. So this Valkyrie is a Macross mecha. And the thing was, though, that Harmony Gold didn't create the Valkyrie. So they didn't have ownership of it. They only had a license to produce toys off the back of it. And in fact, other people also had licenses to produce toys off the back of it. And when you own a banana, you can dictate what people can and can't do when you license them the right to reproduce your banana. So, what that means is that you can say to someone, okay, I will let you produce Robotech Valkyries or Macross Valkyries in sizes from 6 inches to 12 inches in the following countries. So you can slice up your banana and give people little bits of it that they can do what they want with, but you might be able to take that banana back from them after a period of years, and they probably have to pay you for every banana that they produce and sell. So this little guy is a Macross Valkyrie that was produced on a much cheaper budget than something like the original, is it Takatoku? I think it's Takatoku, isn't it? Macross Valkyries were produced. So these were basically a licensed, authorized version of the much bigger Valkyries that you could get. But nonetheless, they are authorized versions despite being much lower quality and much smaller. But they did take a license of them, of the design, and so they could sell these wherever they wanted, but just to the lower end of the market. So although you would be forgiven for thinking that, given the packaging that they use and everything else, that they were in fact knockoffs, as it turns out they weren't. They were legitimately licensed, which does make me smile, because it's just sort of, you do tend to assume that this size of toy and this, with sort of dodgy looking packaging must be a knockoff. But actually it may be a conscious decision on a manufacturer's part to say, well, look, the big boys have already done all the advertising for me. I'm going to see if I can be a bit cheeky, get a license from them, and just do my own thing with it. Reinvent it in my own way, package it in my own way, and I'll see how long I can run for it with. So this I found was sort of pleasantly surprising, because it's a really good, valid version of a Valkyrie with a bit of metal to it, and so in fact, they've even got the VF stickers on the bottom of it as well. I don't think I've actually done a separate video on this one, but I may well do when I've done a bit more research on it. But it's got all the hallmarks of being a Macross Valkyrie at a much smaller scale, but it also at a much lower price point. And they can have it. You can do that when you're the owner of the rights. You can license it in whatever way you like. Now, more questionably come things like this. Now, this is a Robot de Combat, robot fighter. Now, this is basically Topspin. And interestingly, Topspin, the Autobot Transformer jump starter, was probably itself a licensed derivative of a Diaclone or Takara toy. Originally. I haven't done the research on that, so I'm not sure where he did stem from originally, but I know him first as a Transformer. But as Gareth knows, I've picked up a few Topspin derivatives of late, and I don't know whether this is a knockoff or not. But what I do know is that it's got very little detail on the packaging about where he might have been licensed from originally, which leads me to believe he wasn't licensed from anyone originally. Otherwise, you'd probably say that to try and avoid someone coming after you, and to reassure people that you are actually doing it in a legitimate way. So all it says is Fabrique en Chine, made in China. That's it. That's all I've got. So I rather suspect that he is a bit of a rip-off. I think he's a knockoff. Clearly this mould must have been doing the rounds in the early 80s for whatever reason, and I think someone just took advantage of it and decided that they'd run a line of these, possibly even before Transformers were a thing, of course, because I have examples in iShop now of grandstand converters that were licensed, but they were simply licensed from the same source that Transformers ultimately took their licenses from. So they use exactly the same molds, but they all started back in Japan, and it was the Japanese companies that owned all the rights to them. So they were the ones able to give out these international licenses and say, you can have the three-dimensional design, and then you can paint it and so on as you wish. And of course, those characters then became, the sort of their backstories and everything else would have become copyright of the companies that created them. And I guess at some point they probably actually completely bought out those designs. They didn't have to license them anymore. It's quite possible. You often see that. Sometimes competitors will actually just buy out the people whose designs they started using or initially borrowed. So if they get a big takeoff in their success, they'll just buy the competitors, and then they've got the intellectual property rights, and they're the owner of the intellectual property rights going forward. So it can happen like that. The ones that I showed you in the sort of the warm-up video for this premiere, if you're watching this as a premiere, were these guys. So I had this is a Multimac, and I always wondered if they had Zoid Tomy sort of relations, because they've got these little gold androids as their pilots. Now, I somewhat doubt it, because they're produced by a company called Silverlit, and I can't find out a great deal about it as a company. They're not as complex as Zoids, they're more solid. I think they were produced well after Zoids as well. But I do just sort of wonder about, and I think they must have been produced off their own original designs, because clearly fairly mainstream stores were carrying them, but as a very sort of budget line. So rather like that Jetfire example I just showed you, it may be that somebody was trying to sort of echo Zoids a little bit, but do it on a cheaper basis with so no motorization in the one that I'm showing you. Although actually it has got friction. Yeah, it's got a little bit of friction to it, but it doesn't really want to go anywhere. So there is a little bit of friction power in there. But again, Zoids tended to do the wind-up version, and that's a legitimate Zoid. So you can see that is a very, very different sort of creature to the one I just showed you. But the Android pilots are, they're not actually the same scale in fairness to them. So whilst the cockpits do have a certain resemblance, this is where the line between knockoffs and just similar toys blurs, because you could do something that is reminiscent of something else without actually directly copying it, and you can sometimes get trademark issues around doing that. But in terms of the actual three-dimensional designs, it would be hard to make any sort of real sort of ground off the back of that, because they are different designs and there's been no copying. It's just sort of reminiscent of, so that sort of thing is less of an issue. But then I also chuckled the other day when in one of Gareth's videos he was wondering whether what looked to be a sort of masterpiece transformer could in fact of itself be a knockoff of a knockoff. In effect, even though, as I said earlier, I don't think those transformers are knockoffs, because the rights have kind of expired, they've died. So although they are inspired by, they're not actually knockoffs. But of course, that doesn't then stop somebody from copying the new iteration of it whilst it is still protected. So that new iteration, the new way of crafting the robot and the vehicle, is a new intellectual property right in and of itself, if they've not completely directly copied the original. So arguably, they then get a new set of rights themselves, which can be infringed by knockoffs of their version of it. So it's a really, really incredibly tangled web. And it's really interesting in the sense that protection can run out. Even patents can run out over time. And it's, the reason that we see a lot of re-releases happening is that the companies may be doing that just as the original rights are about to peter out. But if they re-release it in the nick of time, they sort of renew the trademark and everything else, then those rights will continue in their ownership, and they'll be able to block anyone doing anything similar when they, for example, release new cartoons like Thundercats did. They kept all the stuff that would have been quite familiar to the original 80s buyers of Thundercats, but did a new cartoon so they could sort of reinforce the copyright in the characters' likenesses, the way they looked. And then they bring the toys out, of course, off the back of that. and they keep using the sort of the relatively familiar logos and so on to try and keep things familiar for people who saw it back in the 80s. So that's what they're going for. They're trying to protect the intellectual property that they've invested a lot of money in down the years. You know, that's absolutely fair enough. The value proposition in terms of, you know, that investment that companies have put into their intellectual property rights is why they don't like knockoffs. Because, of course, if someone can undercut them with a product that is broadly similar, they're going to lose money, which means they don't get the return on the investment they were hoping for. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to me that over time what's happened is that licenses have become much broader. So when I was looking at grandstand converters a few months back, it was apparent that North America was being treated differently to Europe, and countries inside Europe were probably being treated as very separate territories. Now, I don't know if that's still the case, because I think obviously we've seen a lot of more global toy companies come into being over the years, and so they probably just deal with stuff on a fairly broad basis. But, you know, languages, of course, are a reason why you might see different versions of things being released, but then equally, you do see a lot of multilingual packaging. So, you know, it's a global thing, and protecting intellectual property rights globally is very, very costly. Copyright tends to come about automatically, although in some places you do still need to register certain things. Certain low-level three-dimensional rights also tend to come into being automatically, but again, registering them can often give you more rights, and it makes it easier to prove that they are your designs originally, if there's going to be a bun fight over who came up with it first. All sorts of different reasons why knockoffs could be seen as a threat by the originating company and why they would want to sit on them. So, you know, there are ways and means of re-releasing these things. And I think maybe Kickstarters take advantage of this as well, because I dare say there are Kickstarters that have resurrected stuff that would otherwise have been challenged, but for the fact that it's that little bit older and doesn't have that protection anymore. And as I say, it's often also the case that if someone does come up with a reinvention of something, they're actually going to own that because it's theirs, they made it, it's new enough. And if it's kind of completely supplanting what came before because its rights run out, then it's not a knockoff. It's their own product. And people might still, you know, hold their noses about it because it's not coming from the original company. But technically speaking, it won't be a knockoff. It'll be their intellectual property. As long as they're, well, typically as long as they're not pinching the names of characters and so on, because as I mentioned, their protection tends to last that a bit longer. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, whether something is or isn't a knockoff, I don't know. I mean, I think those in the trade can recognise them pretty readily, because obviously, you know, the build quality and everything else won't be there. But with 3D printing and stuff, you know, I don't know if that's still the case, really. Maybe you could 3D print very, very close replicants of, you know, the older toys these days. I just don't know, because I don't know what the scanning techniques are like. So again, if anyone knows a little bit about that side of things, I mean, I know you can obviously download the digital files for lots of stuff these days. And that again is an interesting one, because if you're taking a file that someone else has created and then you in turn produce the 3D print off that and then you paint it yourself, is that you taking a license of that 3D file? Does somebody else actually own the product that you create then? It's really it's very, very complicated. But obviously it gives people a lot of ability to just kind of recreate stuff for their own personal use. So if they don't sell it, they're not making profit from it. You can't really do anything to claim damages from them because you haven't lost money on selling a product, because they're not selling it in competition. They haven't made any profit for you to claim back. So it's all really, really interesting stuff, and a lot of it is, you know, very, very technical. But if you are thinking about doing your own sort of toy line or anything like that, then obviously it's the sort of thing you might want to take some advice on, because there are lots of different ways that you can get protection if that's a sort of an avenue you want to go down. But you've got to be prepared to put some money into getting that protection in a solid way, basically, so not an area I'm a particular specialist in at all, but I'm sort of aware of its existence and it's of interest, and I do come to sometimes run into it in my day job. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your tales of knockoffs and just how sort of blatant they were being in terms of their their claim to any sort of legitimacy, because I'm sure that some do ride it a lot closer to the wire than others. But equally, I think that when I first saw those sort of masterpiece transformers starting to come out, I thought, I see what you're doing there. I thought that's really, really clever, because I really do wonder whether or not anyone could actually come after you. Because I think they found a perfect gap in the market there, where as long as they don't try and use the actual names and the sort of mythology and everything else, they're probably okay. And they seem to be doing okay, because there seem to be a lot of them about. So yeah, it's an area where, as I say, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of opportunity there for people as well, I think, to bring back some of their old favourites, because they've whilst they've stood the test of time in our memories, there isn't the protection for the toy companies anymore if they haven't bothered to keep them alive for themselves. So it's an interesting area, and it's a video I've been meaning to do for a little while. In terms of the videos I am doing at the moment, I'm going to do a separate video on that. But you may have noticed that I'm taking a slightly different approach to what I'm doing at the moment, and I'm going to sort of run through that in another video. So, as ever, if you found that of interest, do like and subscribe, and I'll see you for another one. Cheers for now.